Sergey Viktorovich, hello. There are literally 6 days until the end of the year. It's been a very difficult year, probably a difficult year. It's not a fact that next year will be better, and in general it's hard to believe in the future lately. Nevertheless, let's try to summarize the preliminary results. We are infinitely glad to see you. Thank you for being on our live stream.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sergey Viktorovich, for taking the time to meet with the audience of our program. If you don't mind, then right here at the beginning of the 25th year, because it is clear that now only lazy people do not speak, then in fact inevitable. If you believe the rhetoric and public statements about the negotiations between the Russian side and NATO, the United States, Ukraine on the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. In fact, the talk about the inevitable kind of deal that will suit one of the parties will stop the bloodshed. But judging by the statements that Putin made in the Foreign Ministry, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the end of the summer, our conditions are clear, and no one is going to fulfill them. What can you say about this? Are we not giving away wishful thinking in this rhetoric about negotiations? You know, I think we have had no illusions about the prospects for an easy settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, because it has long been clear to all unbiased observers that it can be resolved exclusively in the context of agreements on reliable security and stability in Europe, agreements that would take into account the interests of the Russian Federation and, of course, legitimate interests of all other countries. Everyone associates some changes with the arrival of the new administration, the administration of Donald Trump. There is a lot of speculation about this. As I said, we have no illusions. There is a fairly firm bipartisan consensus in Washington on the support of the Kiev regime. In American doctrinal documents, our country qualifies as an enemy that needs to be strategically defeated. In free speeches, Biden administration officials even called us an enemy. Therefore, we have never made statements that with the arrival of the Trump administration, the negotiation process on global security, on Ukraine, will definitely begin. This will not be, as many are now trying to hope, an inevitable given. We hear about the interest of Trump, who appointed Special Advisor Mr. Kelleg as his envoy for Ukraine, and are interested in stopping this war as quickly as possible. We have always advocated that this war should not happen, and confirmation of this, and our support for the document between Yanukovych and the opposition in February of the 2014 year, which was guaranteed by European countries, which the opposition tore up the next morning. We supported the Minsk agreements, which stopped the terrorist attack of the Kiev regime against its own citizens in the Donbass. We supported, as you know, President Putin constantly refers to this, the Istanbul agreements in April 2022 year, which were also torn up at the behest of the West by and large. But as the President has repeatedly noted, we never walk away from negotiations. But we need to see serious, concrete proposals when they come to us. And of course, we will make decisions on the reaction to these proposals, based on national interests. The goals of a special military operation, and the President's speech at the Foreign Ministry on June 14 this year. You called this speech as containing conditions. By and large, there are no conditions there. There are simply requirements to fulfill. What we have repeatedly agreed on for many years. The militarization of Ukraine is a direct violation of the agreement that NATO will not swallow more and more countries to the east, and not approach directly on the border of the Russian Federation. Respect for obligations under the UN Charter, including with respect to human rights, including linguistic and religious rights. Is this a condition? This is the minimum that any normal member of the world community is obliged to do. Is the will of the regions in the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic, in the Kherson region, in Zaporozhye, is this some kind of condition? Oh no. The UN Charter explicitly states that all countries are obliged to respect the territorial integrity of those states, that respect the right of a nation to self-determination, as happened during the aforementioned referendums. And most importantly, the Charter requires respect for the territorial integrity of states, whose governments represent the entire population living in a given territory. But can the population of Crimea, Donbass, Novorossiya say that their interests are represented by the Nazi regime, which declared the extermination of all Russian as its main goal, in fact, playing in the interests of the West, which must necessarily remove such a strong competitor as the Russian Federation from the international arena? The West wants to remove any competitor. Ukraine has been chosen as a tool for us. Therefore, the principles formulated by President Putin, they are not prerequisites. This is what follows from international law. And as for the meaning of the conversations that we are hearing now, and that are being conducted in the West and in Ukraine too, we are talking exclusively about a truce, about allowing the Kiev regime to accumulate forces again with the help of the West, and begin new attempts to fulfill the instructions of its masters to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. The President has already spoken about this more than once on a direct line, at the Valdai Forum, at the Forum of Russia calls. A truce will not suit us. We need reliable, legally binding agreements that are aimed at eliminating the main causes of the conflict. The first reason for this conflict, including common security in Europe, the expansion of NATO, the recent decision of the European Union to simply fall under the North Atlantic Bloc, and, in fact, eliminate all differences between these organizations, and, of course, the rights of people who live in the territories, and who spoke in favor of reunification with the Russian Federation. But this does not mean that the demands and respect for linguistic and religious rights, which were legally prohibited by Zelensky, that these requirements should not apply to the rest of Ukraine. There are a huge number of people living there. Most of them speak Russian as their native language, and the linguistic aggression started by the Kiev regime, us of course, will not suit. And the last thing in this regard about how Ukrainians and their hosts see a possible peaceful procedure. Here the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Kuleba, cut through from his new hypostasis, who said that it was necessary to achieve Ukraine's accession to NATO, that even if now the current generation goes to some kind of agreement, and if Ukraine is restored in the next period, then the next generation will certainly be brought up in the spirit of revenge for the defeat, as they believe, which Ukraine will suffer if it respects the will of its citizens.
За поражение, как они считают, которое потерпит Украина, если будет уважать волеизъявление своих граждан.
And therefore Kuleba advises, it is probably necessary to emphasize that either we are now accepted into NATO, and then Ukraine will have obligations to the North Atlantic Alliance not to attack Russia, or such an attack will be absolutely inevitable. Therefore, Olga, concluding her greeting, said that there is little faith in something good, and faith and hope are our traditional fundamental values. And there are many proverbs about these concepts, these meanings, including about hope. Hope dies last, but it is opposed by another proverb, the hopes of young men are nourished. So that they do not feed the young men and do not give the elders joy, we need to work on a final, full-fledged, legally fixed, long-term settlement of problems in Europe, including the Ukrainian crisis.
Well, in this regard, then let's talk about the future. You stated in an interview with Tucker Carlson that the world is closer to nuclear war than ever before. To be honest, it became very disturbing. What is your mood in this regard? What should we do? In the West, they are already buying bunkers. Are they preparing for us too?
Well, we are ready to do everything so that American citizens and citizens of other Western countries do not spend any extra money, which they do not have in excess now, on the construction of bunkers, and we would be ready to do everything to help Western taxpayers save on these bunkers. We have never started discussions about what to do with nuclear weapons and whether they can be used. On the contrary, it was at the initiative of Russia in the 21st year, first at the level of Putin-Biden, and then at the level of the leaders of the entire 5 nuclear weapon states permanent members of the Security Council, that Gorbachev-Reagan's formula of 1900, in my opinion, 87th year, was reproduced. That there can be no winners in a nuclear war, therefore, it should never be untied. And it was Russia's initiative. All other initiatives in which nuclear war options were allowed, similar statements were made exclusively from Western capitals. And the chief of the General Staff of the German Army declared here somehow proudly about a year ago, in my opinion. Let Russia not really frighten us. Let it not forget that NATO is a nuclear alliance. Everyone knows the statements of Lisa Truss, who said that as Prime Minister she would not hesitate to press the nuclear button. The French representatives reminded that they were also a nuclear power. But more recently the generals from the Pentagon openly discussed that if necessary, they could exchange, as they put it, with limited nuclear strikes with the Russian Federation. But to do it in such a way as to emerge victorious from this exchange. We asked them directly. After all, it was the Pentagon general who said such things, asked what it meant. Well, they didn't tell us anything sensible in response. They tried in every possible way to belittle the significance of such statements. They say, these are statements that are purely theoretical in nature, but in reality there was nothing in mind. But is it possible to recognize this as a serious statement of the opinion of an official representative of the military department? In any case, we do not want to warm up the issue of the risks of using nuclear weapons. We firmly proceed from the formula I mentioned, that there can be no winners in a nuclear war, and the President has repeatedly said this, but I would not advise anyone to test our patience. Our determination to defend legitimate national interests by all available means. Putin spoke about this in detail during a direct line, during his previous speeches. Therefore, here we very much hope that those who have ears will hear, those who have brains will understand. Sergey Viktorovich, daily provocations from the Ukrainian side, of course, with the help of NATO countries. Here is one of the latest, drone strikes directly into a residential building in Kazan. Even Western newspapers call the similarity of what happened in New York on September 11, 2001. Similar to that terrorist attack. We remember the beautiful way the United States responded back then. Ours. Is there something holding us back from such an answer? Well, at first, I would not draw direct parallels with the terrorist attack on September 11th. There are many theories, and not even necessarily conspiracy theories, that require us to figure out what happened then, and who organized this attack, and for what purpose. As for the constant terrorist acts resorted to by the Kiev regime, deliberately striking at purely civilian targets, residential buildings, hospitals, polyclinics, shops, places of gathering and recreation of people, this is outrageous. It is a direct violation of all anti-terrorist conventions, all Security Council resolutions on this topic, and, of course, in addition to condemnation, which we express and, unfortunately, to which practically no one joins in the West, and none of the leaders of international organizations, including the UN, the OSCE, UNESCO, and much more, joins.
И не присоединяется никто из руководителей международных организаций, включая и ООН, и ОБСЕ, ЮНЕСКО и многое другое.
Of course, we are not limited to this. We regularly publish information, show relevant videos about how we destroy objects that are directly related to the preparation and implementation of the activities of the armed forces of Ukraine. We warn that the further continuation of such a line will be met with an increasingly decisive response every time. And to be honest, as far as I can understand, being a non-military person, the damage to Kiev's military machine in response, not only in response to these terrorist attacks, but also in general during the special military operation in recent months, it is very, very significant. And then, after all, it is not necessary to give readings in the Kursk region, Bryansk, Belgorod, immediately after the bandit strike, and it is not necessary to do something immediately in the morning. You can wait a little, we are patient people, but sometimes, measure 7 times, cut once. Here it is necessary to measure it so as to cut it off according to the full program.
Thank you very much, Sergey Viktorovich. If you can about Fisio, I understand perfectly well that the negotiations were held behind closed doors. There are no details. There was no press conference statement. If there is at least something that can be communicated to our viewers, at least some details and nuances. In fact, literally everyone has a glimmer of hope for at least some negotiations. Here Fitz has arrived. Here Orban seems to look like a sane person. How are things going with this?
Well, I wouldn't say that no information was provided, because the Kremlin gave the information, Dmitry Peskov commented. And there are no big secrets here. Fitz directly announced that his arrival. The reason for his arrival, the immediate reason, was the upcoming termination of the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine. As Zelensky has repeatedly said, I have spoken publicly more than once and proudly talked about it. We discussed options that would allow gas to continue to flow to countries that, like Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria, as far as I understand, are interested in this. It is their economic interests.
Которые, как и Словакия, как и Венгрия, как и Австрия, насколько я понимаю, в этом заинтересованы. Это их экономические интересы.
It has nothing to do with the obligations within the European Union. They are trying to drive them into commitments to follow a common foreign and security policy, but gas supplies have nothing to do with this. They are related to the normal situation in the country during the winter, so that everything that is necessary for citizens, industry, the social sector, so that all this works. And Zelensky's actions create problems for European countries. There are many there who proudly say that this dependence on Russia should be stopped, as Ursula von der Leyen said. Remember, he had a saying that American liquefied natural gas is cheaper for Germany than Russian. And when the correspondent, of course, asked what figures you have in mind, because everything is quite the opposite. This is an additional burden for the economy, and she declared that American gas is better and cheaper in a political sense. That's it. The willingness and ability to carry out the orders of an elephant that is walking, and around him, he has not yet gone. While there are still donkeys in it in Washington, Democrats, but the Republican elephants will soon come.
демократы.
And let's see how the pug around them will position themselves.
Посмотрим, как моськи вокруг них будут себя позиционировать.
Speaking of gas, Zelensky recently stated in an interview that when asked why don't you help Slovakia,
Совсем недавно Зеленский в каком-то интервью заявил, что когда его спросили, почему вам не помочь Словакии.
well, first of all, he cheated Slovakia, Hungary, and many other figures with sound common sense. And when he was asked why you still do not agree to transit, because Slovakia can buy gas right on the border of Russia with Ukraine, and Slovak gas or Hungarian or someone else's will go through you. He says no, because if they do that, they will still pay Russia for the gas that they will receive at our border. This is the financing of war. Now, if they insisted that they would receive gas at the border, and gas would turn from Russian to Slovak, but they would not pay money to Russia until the end of the war, then it would still be possible to think about it. That is, you see, this person's brains are incomprehensible to normal people. I proceed from the fact that we do not need to comment on his every sneeze, this Zelensky, especially since he sneezes regularly. And all Czechs are different depending on the state of the body. By the way, from his recent pearls, when he was asked about a couple of weeks ago what Russia should do to resolve the crisis, he publicly stated that Russia should go for 3 letters. A few questions later, in the same interview, he said that yes, at the second summit after Bergenstock, when we have already prepared the entire ultimatum, Russia should be called to the second summit and present our demands to it. But if we compare the two statements, what Russia should do to settle and what Russia wants to get to, should get to the second summit, I think he indicated the name and meaning of this very summit in his first phrase. Sergey Viktorovich, your brilliant comments on the situation are exhaustive. Of course, I really want to ask you briefly. Here we are now without an ambassador to the United States for quite a long time. Is this a technical pause or some kind of démarche on our part? No, this is not a démarche. The Americans, by the way, if we talk about their attitude to the new candidate, they said that they welcome the appointment of a professional who devoted most of his career to Soviet-American, Russian-American relations. The departure date, it is planned taking into account the optimal timing of the appearance of a new ambassador in Washington, given that in 3 weeks Donald Trump's inauguration is literally coming. So there is no politics here.
Sergey Viktorovich, if you can briefly talk about personal, did you have time to dress up the Christmas tree? Is there a New Year's mood?
The mood is combative because you can't relax for the new year. There are serious politicians and analysts who do not exclude that on New Year's holidays, during the Orthodox Christmas period, anything can be expected from the Kiev Nazis and their Western instigators, but we somehow try to celebrate this holiday in a cheerful state, in a state of active observation and analysis of events.
В бодром состоянии, в состоянии активного наблюдения и анализа событий, стараемся, конечно, этот праздник отмечать.
Right after our interview, I'm going to go to the Christmas tree that stands in our lobby, and it's a wish tree.
И это елка желаний.
Both my deputies and I are trying to actively participate in this very noble initiative. It is clear that it came to an end. Huge.
Foreign Minister Lavrov.
Thank you.